So in the spirit of this exciting new Bryn Faith project and the religion in empire, I want to frame the project here around or with these three considerations about how international infrastructure development in Nepal under China's BRI functions in several overlapping but importantly interconnected modalities. As a symbolic project of national development imaginaries, namely in Nepal, a process and practice of state formation, again in Nepal, but moving particularly towards the borderland areas and to a degree over as well as a vector for the spatial operations of geopolitical power, which I'll try to make a case for how we see that happening in the context of Chinese development and political and security concerns outside of the PRC. But before going there, I want to respond a little bit in conversation with David's point about how the BRI isn't particularly mapped very well. We could say very poorly, and an important question there is this intentional, right? So as we've seen, and I'll show a couple slides here, a variety of maps which depict a usefully approximate but really inexact networks of roads and rails and sea lanes and other transport infrastructures, it's come together in this assemblage of known as China's BRI. However, and I think this is a part of the important paradox which I want to address and unpack in this talk, for such a global infrastructure program that reflects and advances Beijing's really ambitious project to lead and transform models of international development, not just in its Asian neighborhood, but truly at a global scale. Why are these BRI maps so imprecise and frankly unofficial? Now, I want to bring this question to bear in the context of Tibet and the Himalaya, especially. So this is just a shot of three maps that we see out there quite frequently by the Merrick's research group in Germany, one from the Straits Times on the top right, and of course one from The Economist on the lower right. And it's apparent, and I think that it's both conspicuous in its absence, is any representation of BRI lanes, routes, going across the Tibetan plateau into Nepal, and really there's very little in through Xinjiang as well. And yet these spaces are not only highly important to current BRI projects, but in the narrative of the BRI that harkens back to Silk Road Imaginaries and those historical infrastructures are really social networks, Tibet and Xinjiang, of course, were central to that. So why is there such fuzziness or perhaps strategic ignorance in leaving some of these important spaces out of our BRI depictions? What I'll try to do today is, in moving away from these maps and zooming in more closely to Himalayan areas of Nepal and BRI projects there, question and problematize the ways in which the normalization of these maps or their circulation does an effective job of vaporizing the importance of Tibet in removing a very political problem and complicated issue from broader BRI projects and objectives. But now I'd like to address this invisibility that many of these non-mapped Chinese development projects, particularly in the form of roads and railways, in fact, accomplish some of these imperial tasks of territorialization and state control across scales. So I don't think I need to say too much about my background here in the interest of time. Just want to thank David again for the introduction and say this project that you all are pursuing in Hong Kong really is a convergence of many of my longstanding interests, both academically and personally and professionally, in the Himalayan region, where we have this confluence of borderland infrastructure and post-disaster development in the spaces of transforming trans-Himalayan geopolitical relationships, which often are framed or conditioned or motivated by particular Tibetan geographies. And by Tibetan geographies, I mean linguistic, cultural, religious practices, identities, not just of Tibetan ethnic minorities of the PRC, but ethnic Tibetan populations outside of the PRC, and particularly in Nepal. So these BRI programs in Nepal, which I'll speak to in a bit more detail soon, reflect a new phase of Sino-Nepali geopolitics that I think it can usefully be conceptualized as infrastructural relations. They comprise a new configurations of bilateral energy, transport, and security collaboration between Nepal and China. We see them operating at and across a number of important nested or intersecting scales, the geopolitical, the national, the corporal, and the body personal scales. And importantly, they index a new model of development that I think is worth considering, something called development with Chinese characteristics in the trans-Himalayan region. That is, what does Chinese development do differently than other models of development we've seen around the world, and particularly in Nepal, and especially over the past 50 or 60 years? Chinese development is different. So I want to look at this Chinese development in Nepal in roughly a 5-year timeline, and looking across place and time here. I'll focus the talk and bring your attention to really 3 main zones of development here in Nepal, starting on the right side of the map in the east, the historical Arnico-Friendship Highway, which has historically been the primary trade route and also historic pilgrimage route between Nepal and Tibet. The road in the development area in the middle, in Rasua, between Kirong and Chavrubesi, has rapidly become, over the past 5 years, the primary point of intersection of business, of trade, of tourism, and increasingly of pilgrimage, both Buddhist pilgrimage to Tibet, as well as Chinese Buddhist pilgrimage to Nepal. So it's a new intersection, and really the center point of many of the BRI projects in Nepal. And now further to the west here, where I also have a research project in the district of Mustang, which is an ethnically Tibetan but culturally distinct area of Nepal that is on really the north slope of the Himalayan range. And there have been ongoing Chinese development projects there that have generated a lot of anxiety in the community there. And we'll talk more about that shortly. So the 5-year timeline, roughly, beginning in 2014 with some geophysical events, landslides, followed by earthquakes in 2015, and a profound response from the Chinese state in humanitarian and infrastructural contexts. That led to a shift in the prioritization of roads from this Arnico-Friendship Highway on the far right to the middle road, the Rasua-Kirong Highway. But since then, more recently, there's been an oscillation between these 2 roads with respect to development priorities, and especially in the context of dry ports being developed by the Chinese International Development and Cooperation Agency and other Chinese development programs under the auspices of China Aid. Now, I'm really going to end or suspend the analysis really last year in 2019, because as many of us have experienced in all kinds of contexts, 2020 has been a year of suspension and paralysis. Part of this is COVID related, part of this is geopolitically inflected, and quite a bit of it has been challenges that the Nepali state has faced in acting on many of the preliminary agreements with Beijing to move forward in some of these BRI projects. So the talk will really follow a 2014 to 2019 timeline. And I want to frame the talk really in these three contexts. The first is disaster and reconstruction, and I'll put that together with these national imaginaries of state making in Nepal. The second context is aid, Chinese aid and extraterritorial policies. So how Chinese power is moving beyond the bounds of the PRC and is exercised in Nepal. And that is both motivated by and leveraged upon ethnographic anxieties and ethnographic concerns. Now, the third context here will be a closer look at the BRI projects and how many of these promises have been challenged to get off the ground. And yet, even though there may not be actual construction or significant progress made on these BRI projects, the discursive power that they present within the Nepali citizenry, for Nepali political actors, from the everyday to the elite levels, carries an incredible amount of weight. And so the BRI gets a lot of work done in Nepal, even when things aren't getting made. So let's look in the first context here, in disaster and reconstruction, and how this has accelerated the pursuit of many of Nepal's national imaginaries of development, or in the Nepali word, bikas, through infrastructure projects. So I want to go back to 2014, when there was a severe landslide in Sintapolchok along the Sunkosi River, which blocked the Friendship Highway, this main trade route and transit corridor between the PRC and Nepal. That occurred in fall at the end of the monsoon season in 2014, and it motivated an early opening of the Kirong-Rasua highway or corridor. So if we think back to the map I was showing before, the far right road was closed, the middle road gets opened earlier than it was planned, inaugurating the grand new gatehouse and customs house here on the Chinese side in the TAR, and the ceremonies that were held on this newly inaugurated bridge. This is a route that had been highly anticipated for years, if not decades. However, it was also the opening of a route in Nepal that had long been closed to foreign tourism, as well as to other formalized official bilateral trade. Part of the reason for this are some of the Tibetan exile communities that live there, and it was what my colleague Jason Kahns has conceptualized as a particularly sensitive space in Nepali history. So again, it was a shift from the road on the far right here to the middle. So the opening of this new route was in many ways a resolution that not only transferred or resolved the roadblock and the suspension of trade activities, but it inaugurated and invited a significant new scale and relationships between Kathmandu and Beijing in geopolitical terms, in terms of aid and investment, and as we'll get into further, in terms of bilateral security concerns. So 2014 was this point of inflection with the landslide, the early opening of the road, and it also, not incidentally, was the first year in which Chinese foreign direct investment eclipsed that of India. Delhi and New Delhi and in India have a long-standing position as Nepal's largest donor, as a highly influential political actor. And there's been a lot of historically tension, friction, and even animosity about that. Chinese FDI surpassing Indian FDI, and since that time it has maintained that position, was another dimension of this shifting and really scaling up in Sino-Nepali relations. So this is all just in 2014 and then in March of 2015, we have the Nepal earthquakes. I'm sorry, in April of 2015, we have the Nepal earthquakes. Late April, and then in the second week of May, serious earthquakes in the center of Nepal, in Gorkha district, and then a secondary earthquake on the cusp of Dolakha and Sindhupalchok districts in May. Devastating, killing upwards of 9,000 Nepalese, crushing or crumbling infrastructure in not only in the Nepal capital of Kathmandu, but along the roadways, as well as in villages throughout the country, particularly in borderland regions, which were hard to access for humanitarian and emergency aid projects. However, in these borderland areas, there have been significant Chinese development projects with respect to hydropower, hydroelectric generation, and borderland road development. Some of these, but not all of them, are related to the BRI. Again, there's a fuzziness sometimes about what is and what is not a BRI project. Much of that perhaps doesn't matter. What does matter is the way in which Chinese capacity for construction and earth removal and development is marshaled and mobilized in humanitarian and emergency response modalities. So not only were Chinese operators able to effectively respond quickly and powerfully to this emergency, but it furthered and in fact deepened and closened this relationship between Kathmandu and Beijing and the Nepali and the Chinese states with respect to infrastructure and aid as a unique form of relationship. These are Chinese earth movers that had come up from one of the hydropower projects along the Trisuli River in Rasua district to open up the road and help alleviate the humanitarian crises in the northern district of Rasua. But the year of 2015 was particularly complicated in Nepal, not only with respect to the earthquakes and the disaster and crisis that presented, but highly contentious domestic political transformations. The huge amount of relief aid that was promised in billions of dollars to Nepal was contingent on the promulgation of a new Nepali constitution, which had stalled in the Nepali parliament for years and years. Foreign donors said, for this money to be issued and allocated for rebuilding the country, there needs to be a more functional government structure and system. So after many years of slow progress, the Constitution was accelerated and passed and promulgated in late summer of 2015. However, that Constitution inscribed and codified a number of highly problematic policies by which ethnic minority populations, particularly those in southern Nepal, were marginalized. The Madesi population, which has particularly close kinship relations and legacies between Nepal and populations in northern India, were particularly marginalized, and communities protested this new constitution, saying there were ethnic marginalizations written in, there were significant questions raised about the new provincial divisions, the bordering of the new federal state. And in addition to protests that took place across the southern belt of Nepal in the Tarai district, there was also a blockade between Nepal and India's border. What that led to was an acute fuel crisis. Historically, Nepal has imported 100% of its petroleum needs, gasoline, diesel, kerosene, propane, from India. The Indian border was blocked. Some analysts believe that this was orchestrated and coordinated by the Indian government. Others believe it was coordinated and orchestrated as a collusion between the Nepali police and the petroleum importers. There are many different conspiracy theories. I'm not going to get into those now, but what it did was effectively block the border. And in so doing, bring reconstruction in Nepal to a standstill and exacerbate an already severe humanitarian crisis. These anti-constitution protests continued for weeks and months and really led to a paralyzation of earthquake construction, as well as road repair and other development projects, which had been hoped to resume in the post-earthquake period as part of the broader scheme to build back better. Incidentally, we see this term building back better coming up in our electoral politics here in America right now as well. But without going down that rabbit hole, here again, the Chinese government and the Chinese state and Chinese private operators were able to come to Nepal's rescue. In a largely symbolic but nevertheless effective response to the blockade at Nepal's southern border and the fuel crisis that was paralyzing the entire country, the Chinese embassy in Kathmandu pledged 1,000 tons of petroleum delivery to Nepal. Now, this is really a drop in the bucket of Nepal's energy needs at this time. But nevertheless, 12 petrol tankers was highly symbolic and unprecedented, because as mentioned before, historically Nepal had received 100% of its petroleum and its fuel needs from India. So this brought Beijing and the Chinese state and China as an actor. I don't want to grant China sort of this monolithic identity, although it often is articulated in that way in Nepal. But this led to a view from Kathmandu and throughout Nepal north towards China as a particular kind of friend that India very much was not. This type of friendship and this connectivity has been articulated and re-articulated in very important ways since that time. So from 2015 up until 2019, when Nepal's President Bandari was at the Second Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, said that for a landlocked country, and she was referencing in part this period of the fuel crisis, connectivity is of paramount importance in its socioeconomic development. With enhanced connectivity, vast opportunities for trade, investment, tourism, and people-to-people relations will open up. So, moving into our second frame here, aid, and then the extraterritorial policy and practices that are extended through this, and the ways in which ethnographic anxieties both motivate and articulate these aid and territorial practices. So here again, if you look on the photo on the left, we have in the distance here, this Chinese gatehouse at the Rasuagari-Kerong border. 15 or 20 kilometers south from here is this old Tibetan enclave of Gatikola, which was tragically devastated in the earthquakes of 2015. This photo was taken a month or two before the earthquakes. When I visited with the Lama of Gatikola in February of 2015, we asked him some of the feelings the community had expressed over the unprecedented presence of Chinese development projects in this valley, hydropower, road construction, trade. He said, we're quite nervous. We look north and we see what China did to Tibet. On the one hand, it's tremendous economic development and growth. On the other hand, it's been a an extremely complicated human rights history and ethnic, religious, linguistic persecution and policies that have really transformed Tibet. And the community here said, we've seen what has happened in Tibet. We're worried that that could happen here. The Nepali state has never taken care of us. Chinese aid is coming. Chinese development is here. What will come along that road as well? There's a rich legacy in history of Tibetan cultural practice in this region. Although the Tibetan exile community is relatively small, the indigenous ethnic Tamang community has particularly close ties to Tibet. And the photo on the right was an annual festival in February called the Mani Chirpi, in which a historical event by which the Tibetan armies had traveled down into Nepal and fought with the Tamang and the Nepali state and were pushed further north. And yet, although there was this military history, there was a deepening of religious association and practices attributed to Buddhist lineages related to Padmasambhava and Guru Rinpoche and Milarepa in the Nyingma and Kagyu schools continue to be celebrated and thrive in this region. So this celebration, Mani Chirpi, is something both it has a militaristic historical dimension as well as a Vajrayana tradition and practice commemorating the work of Guru Rinpoche and Milarepa in this region. So there's this very important Tibetan Buddhist practice and identity in the area, which is certainly not lost on Chinese actors in the area. So I want to focus on here briefly on some of the other Tibetan and ethnic traditions and practices in these borderland areas and move further to the west to the Mustang and Tibet road as well. Well, development projects in Mustang have not been as closely framed within BRI programs. There is nevertheless an important trajectory of Chinese aid over the past decade in the villages of northern Mustang, as well as in villages throughout at least 14 districts of northern Nepal, almost all of which have ethnic and indigenous communities that maintain and practice particularly close relations with brethren on the other side of the border in Tibet. This occurs through mechanisms of marriage, of kinship, of trade, of business, of religious practice, of religious monastic education. These are relationships that go back for centuries. Mustang is not unique in this regard. It's just one of the places where I've done some work. So that's why I bring it into the frame of analysis here. So on the one hand, we have this very rich Tibetan Buddhist tradition in the region, and we also have an increasingly securitized state. This is the Nepal-China border on the right side at the Korala, at one of the higher elevation points of this border, where closed circuit cameras, solar-powered electrical systems, and a fenced border mark an otherwise pretty desolate space. However, when one visits this border, out from the distance, Chinese patrols invariably respond. The ethnic communities from Mustang do not go up here because of the risk of arrest. There are many accounts, which I've written about in several articles, of Loba or Mustangi populations being arrested in this region on the Nepali side of the border by Chinese officials for posing what threats they don't understand. It has really become an area off limits to Nepali citizens of of ethnically Tibetan heritage as an unofficial policy. What else is going on in the region are major solar development and electrification projects in the Mustang capital of Lo-Montang, as well as another one of these major dry ports in the valley of and village of Nechung, which historically is an agricultural area. The photo on the right here has been designated as a new major dry port under development approximately 20 kilometers down from the border photo I showed in the previous slide. So this area has been not only targeted, but activated as another important space of Chinese development, Chinese funded, Chinese facilitated infrastructure development in Nepal's border areas. So looking back to our timeline again, in 2014, Chinese foreign direct investment eclipses Indian. In 2015, we have the earthquakes in Beijing's largest ever humanitarian operation, designated for Nepal. 2015 and 2016, Chinese foreign direct investment to Nepal continues to climb to 2/3 of Nepal's total FDI, and it continues. In 2016, this paradigm shift moves even further or even closer together, in that Beijing and Kathmandu issue a joint statement, which I'll speak to in another minute here, which includes new articulations of mutual agreement to China's the One China policy and an extradition agreement. Historically, Tibetan exiles and refugees passed through Nepal with ultimately it was a problematic but an unofficial agreement with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees that Tibetan exiles that reached Nepal would be moved along to the exile community in India, and whereupon they would apply for refugee status. Under new terms of Beijing and Kathmandu's joint statement, this policy no longer applies for Tibetan exiles and refugees. The control of Tibetan space, both historical, cultural spaces in the borderlands, as well as the spaces through which refugees and exiles move and are processed and facilitated in Kathmandu, has changed dramatically in the past 5 and even 10 years. As well as in 2016 and 2017, a new trade and transit treaty came into effect, which scaled up these relationships further. 2017, new aid and loan packages, particularly a new designation of 5-year food aid plans, which were these more informal, but nevertheless significant Chinese aid packages to Nepal's 14 northern districts. In 2017 and 2018, there were new planning agreements for railways, pipelines, and transmission lines, further connecting the Tibetan plateau with Nepal's northern areas. And then this was more formalized. Many of these disaggregated treaties and policies and aid packages and investment programs took new shape under the auspices of the Belt and Road at the 2019 Belt and Road Forum. And this arrangement is particularly encapsulated in, it's a mouthful here, the Nepal-China Trans-Himalayan multidimensional connectivity network that brings many of these all together. So what we have, and as I've written about previously, is this handshake across the Himalayas, which is growing ever firmer and ever closer. And the proverbial elephant in the room here, or New Delhi, is no longer the close confidant and operator as Delhi has historically been in Kathmandu in Nepal, but in fact it's China. And Beijing, operating both as a diplomatic actor, but is also a corporate and business leader, is bringing together this long objective for development, or bikas, which is both a material thing, roads and infrastructure, hydropower, electricity, that kind of development, but also social development, modernization, the modernization of Nepali society, the modernization of a state. So it's both a material and an ideological form of development that is advanced and accelerated and realized through the Chinese gift of development. So 1 year ago, following the Belt and Road Forum, in Xi Jinping's visit to Kathmandu, Nepal and China signed a number of MOUs, memoranda of understanding, that articulated this closer arrangement between infrastructure development, borderland security, investment, and extraterritorial cooperation. So I won't read these all, but what I've highlighted in red are these instruments related to infrastructure development, international trade, and state security. So this includes boundary management systems, treaties between Nepal and the PRC on mutual legal assistance in criminal matters, cooperation between the Ministry of Physical Infrastructure and Transport of Nepal and Ministry of Transport of the PRC, and the Nepal-China cross-border railway project. These they don't have the Belt and Road written into it here, but these are projects that are in Nepal's and China's 9-point BRI agreement. The Ministry of Home Affairs of Nepal and Ministry of Emergency Management, cooperation in risk reduction and emergency response. And the last, I'll just go to number 19, an exchange of letter for border security equipment and office equipment. So there's this tightening in terms of infrastructural relationships here between infrastructure development and security cooperation. So President Bandari also at the second Belt and Road Forum spoke about this trans-Himalayan multidimensional connectivity network, which, including the Nepal-China cross-border railway, will boost connectivity not only between Nepal and China, but other countries in the region. So after a prolonged political transition, Nepal has achieved political stability. So our objective ahead is to bring about visible transformation in the living standard of our people. That is the ongoing pursuit of bikas, this material and ideological form of development, as well as the advancement of this national imaginary of state formation through infrastructure. This is really framed through or by Nepal's strategic road network, which designates 6 or now 8 corridors running from central Nepal north up these historic trade routes and historic pilgrimage routes that are being modernized into new highways, potentially new railroads, into new power corridors. So in the last few minutes here, I'd like to talk more about in the third frame of analysis here, how these projects and promises articulate a new form of geopolitical power across the Himalayan region, and bring it to bear, or bring the attention to bear more closely on the BRI. So then In 2018, Nepal proposed a very ambitious list of 35 projects for the Belt and Road. Beijing had invited a submission of projects to pursue. Nepal went big. Beijing responded, said, let's reduce this to something more achievable, nevertheless ambitious. Nepal reduced and truncated that list to 9 key projects. That's the improvement of this Rasuagadi-Kathmandu road. That's this main highway. The development of other border roads, Himantanka and Hile, as well as Dipyal, the development of the historical Tokabidor road. So we see the road construction is really central to those BRI projects, as well as electricity. The Gulchi Rasuagadi Kirong transmission line, this so-called sky train, the Kirong Kathmandu Railway, as well as 2 other significant hydroelectrical projects. Many of these, again, are encapsulated or help to comprise the Nepal-China trans-Himalayan multidimensional connectivity network. If we look back in this Kirong-Rasuagadi corridor, what we see forming is really a power corridor, a density of not just improved roadways that can facilitate the movement of higher volumes of cargo, but a density of hydroelectric projects. These yellow, green, and red circles here are hydro projects under construction, under survey, or under operation, many of which are Chinese funded, or Chinese operated, or Chinese tendered in the Rasuagadi Kirong corridor. I'm sorry. We also have the trace of where the railway is envisioned to travel through the same region, as well as this transmission line. So we have nearly, and as well as the Tokabidor road, we have really half of the 9 BRI projects here in one of these riverine infrastructural corridors. This is where we see a density and concentration of infrastructure development, of geopolitical power, of financialization of hydropower and development projects, and of heightened anxiety and concerns for communities with long-standing ethnic, cultural, kinship ties to Tibet. If we look elsewhere in these corridors, now I'm returning further east now to the Sunkosi corridor, where we started and where the landslide devastated the road and suspended traffic and trade in 2014, we see how China has come to the rescue again. After the earthquakes, China Aid and Bureau 14 of the Chinese Railway Construction, the Chinese Ministry of Railways and the Chinese Railway Construction Company rebuilt the road, as well as the historic Friendship Bridge, which was the first point of crossing and access between Nepal and China, as well as completion of the grand Larcha Dry Port. So China Aid's post-disaster recovery for this region led to Nepal's first and grandest dry port, which is about 10 kilometers down from the PRC border and the Friendship Bridge along the Friendship Highway. This was opened and inaugurated in May of 2019. And despite the fanfare and great anticipation behind this, it has been challenged and stymied to operate as effectively as envisioned because of ongoing problems with continual landslides, continual infrastructural failures on the Nepal side by virtue of the highly unstable geomorphological terrain on which it's built, as well as ongoing problems related to the COVID pandemic, and really the suspension of development projects in Nepal. This points to the need, both recognized but unrealized in Nepal, of the need for multiple trade corridors and economic corridors, and what I will call power corridors, to operate in tandem, in parallel together. We see one is not enough. Invariably, they get closed and washed out by landslides. The roads collapse. There's certainty that there will be further seismic activity in the Himalaya. How soon? We don't know, but it could be soon. So there's a further efforts to development all three of these zones as new highways, as new dry ports, as new development corridors, as well as others, going through Gorkha, going through the far west of Nepal in Humla, in the far east of Nepal, Tapoljung, along the strategic road network. And with Chinese assistance, Nepal envisions 6 to 8 of these development corridors. What the road ahead will really look like is frankly a big question and anyone's guess. After a year and a half of anticipation and excitement and some anxiety about what will come out of the Belt and Road Forum, we see a lot of talk, particularly from Nepali officials, but we don't necessarily see a lot getting done just yet. However, we do see this handshake across the Himalaya maintaining a firm grip. As Nepal's former Nepal's former foreign minister articulated prior to the Belt and Road Forum, Nepal takes pride in seeing China's growing profile on the world stage, both politically and economically. China's role is very important in shaping the global agenda for a just and equitable world order. We strongly believe that Nepal-China friendship will always be in the interests of our two countries and people. Territorial size, population, and level of development have never been the elements of constraint in defining Nepal-China friendship. Rather, sovereign equality and mutual respect have always remained at the center, buttressing our cooperative partnership. So in wrapping up here, what we see is an overlap of these interests. We see Beijing able to scale up its international development program, taking a more prominent position on the global stage as a development actor through China Aid, through the CIDCA, through the BRI. We see also this as a mechanism to help supervise, surveil, securitize, and control Tibetan populations, which are a prevailing concern for Beijing. We have the opening up of new markets, not just in Nepal, which is perhaps a relatively small spatial fix for China's tremendous overcapacity and surplus of capital. But if these roadways and power corridors can really be activated, there's a much larger market further south in the Indian state and the broader subcontinent, right? So Nepal could potentially become a transit space here. And we see the localization of broader geopolitical dynamics in Nepal as India's historical role is challenged and perhaps eclipsed by China in the 21st century. So looking back from 2015 to today, this post-earthquake Chinese investment in infrastructure development, it undergirds these territorializing projects of the Nepalese state and the efforts to extract new political and economic values from borderland regions. So it represents, so that was the first framing. Second, it represents this gift of development that connects Nepali ambitions of Vikas with Chinese anxieties over ethnic and exiled Tibetan populations outside of the PRC. And then in geopolitical terms, it reflects a strategic reorientation of geopolitical anxieties in Nepal, alliances in Nepal, and namely a pivot from India to China. So, in conclusion, a view of transborder aid and development dynamics following these recent Himalayan geophysical disasters, and especially in the forms of new BRI infrastructural relations, shows that China's increasingly prominent role in Nepal advances Nepali state formation, while it also addresses Beijing's own economic and security interests abroad. So why does this matter? Why does a small state like Nepal, with innumerable challenges of development, matter in broader global context? Why does Nepal matter, and why do we need to pay attention to this, and why is it important that these BRI projects are left off of the map? As David raised the problem with these BRI maps at the introduction? Well, by studying the relationships between disaster aid, infrastructure development, we can better understand the cross-scalar links between broad international processes of South-South development, regional geopolitical dynamics, and localized community-level experiences with shifting subjectivities under different state powers, and how these relationships are rearticulated, reimagined, and reformed between different states and their citizens. In the case of Nepal, it's a fairly asymmetric neighborhood. So I urge us, as we continue to watch the expansion and the effects of the BRI, not just in Nepal and Himalayan or Tibetan context, but around the world, we also stay closely attuned to the symmetries or the asymmetries of power. With that, I will conclude and want to say thank you again to the Institute and the terrific research projects there at University of Hong Kong, as well as Dr. David Palmer, Mohammed Al-Sudari, and Lunar Tong for inviting me and organizing this talk. Thank you very much.